One of the deck's oldest rivals, Hand Control, was about to be powered up substantially by the release of Legacy of Darkness in June and Pharaonic Guardian in July. These two sets changed the game in plenty of ways, and one of the most notable ways they did is by giving Hand Control a bunch of new tools.
I summon the spirit monster known as Yata.
Legacy of Darkness had Yata and Drop-Off, and Pharaonic Guardian had Spirit Reaper and Donzalug. What was perhaps the most surprising about these 4 cards is just how good they actually wound up being. None of them were all too different from White Magical Hat after all, and if that card hadn't pushed Hand Control over the edge, well, it was hard to see why these would. Donzalug in particular was almost identical, but despite this, he was arguably the most important piece of support the deck received in either set. There were a handful of different reasons for this, but more than anything else, the card owed a lot of its success to Mystic Tomato, which had an extremely strong metagame presence at the time. Tomato had always been fairly popular following its debut in Magic Ruler, but now that Sengen and Witch were both limited, it was seeing an unprecedented level of representation. The fact that everybody could only play one Witch and one Sengen meant 2 things. First, that they showed up in the hand a lot less frequently, and second, that using one to search for the other was a much bigger commitment now that players had no extra copies to fall back on. Mystic Tomato did a lot to minimize both issues by providing consistent access to both monsters and letting players pick which one they wanted to summon based on what monsters they wanted to search for. Anyone who was already playing Mystic Tomato for this reason didn't have to go out of their way to include Donzalug in their deck, since he was also a dark monster with 1500 or less attack. This was one advantage he had over White Magical Hat, the other being his higher attack point score. One of Hat's most glaring weaknesses was the fact that it could be killed by pretty much any non-flip monster in the game. While Donzalug was no powerhouse, Sengen and Witch couldn't kill it, and it could at least trade with an attack position Mystic Tomato. Together, these 2 things meant that he was safer and more convenient to summon and easier to keep alive than Magical Hat was, which of course also meant that resolving his effect was a lot easier too. All of these things also applied to Spirit Reaper. While this monster couldn't attack over really any meta-relevant monsters, it made up for this by itself being immune to battle destruction. This protection gave the card added utility outside of its role in hand control decks, particularly as a stalling tool, and ironically made it an effective shield against other monsters with discard effects like its own.
Spirit Reaper was also another one that became a very popular card.
Donzalug was really good.
Donzalug was broken.
Even when they weren't actually able to resolve their effects, both monsters, Donzalug in particular, were capable of applying a lot of pressure by simply being on the field. It wasn't uncommon for players to use cards like Raigeki and Mirror Force just to kill one, or to search for Gemini Elf with Witch for the same reason. Conversely, they also made a person's power cards more valuable, not just because they could be used to get rid of either monster, but also because it was easy for both Donzalug and Spirit Reaper to take advantage of big swings in momentum. Following up a Raigeki or Dark Hole activation with an attack from one of these 2 was an often devastating 1-2 punch that was very difficult to recover from, and there were plenty of other cards floating around the meta landscape that could generate similar openings for them. A lot of this also applied to Yata, and that's to say that Yata was good for many of the same reasons that these cards were, but it was different in a few ways that were, while subtle, still very important. One of the most unique things about this card was that it didn't have a discard effect, but instead forced whoever it dealt damage to skip their next draw phase. Now, at a glance, this may seem almost identical to the effect of a card like White Magical Hat, since both have the same activation conditions and both leave the opponent with 1 less card in their hand. The difference becomes apparent when asking the following question: what happens when these monsters attack somebody who doesn't have any cards in their hand? Due to the nature of their effects, there was actually a universal way to play around most of the hand control monsters already built into the game. Many players, upon seeing a Spirit Reaper or a Donzalug that they didn't have an answer for, would begin setting as many cards as possible from their hand to the field. These monsters, and even cards like Delinquent Duo for example, couldn't force someone to discard cards they didn't have to begin with, after all. From a certain perspective though, you could say that's exactly what Yata did. This was the only hand control monster that could actually stop the player it attacked from getting a hold of new resources. Now, under normal circumstances, practically speaking, an attack from Yatagarasu wasn't any more devastating than an attack from Zalug, Reaper, or Magical Hat. If any of these monsters attacked the player with 4 cards in their hand, then after their next draw phase, they would still have 4 cards in their hand as opposed to 5. Where things diverge a little bit is what happens when these monsters attack somebody who doesn't have any cards in their hand. In 3 of these 4 cases, the effects won't actually do anything, and the attacked player will have 1 card in hand after their next draw phase. In Yatagarasu's case, however, after the draw phase, the attacked player's hand will still be empty. This player, now completely out of resources, would, under normal circumstances, not be able to do anything to protect themselves from being attacked by Yata on their opponent's following turn, and so their draw phase would be skipped again on their next turn, then again on the turn after that, then again on the turn after that, over and over and over until they finally ran out of life points.